Russian playwright Anton Chekhov wrote a number of plays that were all sort of set in 19th century Russia, and they centered around a group of sort of cultured, aristocratic elites whose lives were just full of restlessness and anxiety because they just could not find out a way to rest and be settled and be happy. They often, these plays often take place out in the countryside, and they spend all their time in the countryside, but they're talking about Moscow all the time. They're talking about what's happening and the center of culture and ideas and the luminaries from Moscow. And these plays are sort of both tragic and comedic at the same time because you watch these people living these lives of despair because they just cannot settle into their life. And at the same time, it's kind of funny. You watch people do ridiculous things in these plays because they're just running this rat race all the time. And there's this one character in Chekhov's play, The Seagull, named Nina, and you see her on this journey over the course of the play. She begins as sort of this, wide-eyed, aspiring young actress. She's out in the countryside, and she just runs this very predictable trajectory where she gets taken in by these luminaries, and again, her eyes are just so big. She wants all this stuff, and over the course of the play, you see her pursue her dreams and all the things she wants, and by the end of the play, she is just so tired. She's just been ground up by the mill of this machine that gives a few special places to one or two people at the top, but for everyone else, just grinds their dreams into a grist. This is what Nina says to her friend at the end of The Seagull. She says this: "I used to be so happy, blissful, like a child. I'd wake up every morning and burst out singing. I loved you," the friend she's speaking to. "I dreamed of fame, and now, tomorrow morning, it's off to the next town, third class. And then there, it's the businessmen with their little invitations. What a miserable life." She goes on to say, "I'm so exhausted. If only I could rest, just rest. If only I could rest, just rest." There's a particular form of exhaustion that comes from being ground up by hardship over time, or from seeing dreams that you really wanted to come true just pop like a balloon. They never came to pass, and there's a sort of exhaustion that we can experience in those things. And our society is in a place where we're experiencing this. We are exhausted. We've just been through so much stuff over the last couple of years. We're just so, frankly, tired. We're burned out. Burnout culture. Everyone's talking about burnout. Everyone is exhausted and burned out. There was an article that ran in Vox in January of 2022 titled, "How to Heal Our National Exhaustion." And this article really has two halves. The first half is talking about all the things that have led to our national exhaustion. And it just runs through the list of all the things that we would have been talking about in January 2022. Burnout on top of burnout, the pandemic, declining empathy in people, we can't get along anymore. The article's even talking about in that time how some experts are talking about the possibility of civil war. I mean, just the rate of things that are burning us out and making us tired just takes up the whole first half of this article. And then the second half says, so in the face of all of that, how can we rest? How can we rest? And basically all the second half of the article has to say is, take that extra day off. Watch that show on Netflix that you've been wanting to watch. Surround yourself with people that encourage you to relax. I mean, this is a quote from the second half of the article. It says, this is what rest can look like. A restful day can look different for everyone. It could be watching a movie or cooking or just taking a mental rest from the constant pressures of problem solving. For some people, work can even be restful. He said, the expert they're talking about, especially if it happens on their own terms. And look, I want to be charitable towards this because no one has any other answer than this. There's no other answer out there. But this article is wildly unbalanced. We're like, these are all the things that are leading us to be exhausted. And just like, watch this, take that day off. This isn't going to work. This won't work. Faith is supposed to help us in this, right? Faith is supposed to help us somehow feel rested, but so often, people of faith and people who don't have faith are just as burned out as the other one. It's like, what difference is this making? Why are we so exhausted in our world today? How on earth can we have any rest? And what does our exhaustion and the question of rest mean for the life of faith? Does faith have anything at all to offer with respect to rest? These are the questions we're going to be looking at today. We're in the middle of a sermon series titled, "Why Does It Feel Like God Isn't Real?" And we've been looking at the conditions of belief in our modern Western secular time that influence the kind of faith we're able to have in this time. Faith can either be easier or harder to come by in certain situations based on the conditions that are present in that situation. We've been walking through a sermon series. We've been looking for the conditions of our time. If we don't understand our time, we do not understand the faith that we have here. So we've been trying to grow in our understanding. For the last 4 weeks, we've been unpacking these ideas that have made faith hard in our time. We've talked about secularity. We've talked about disenchantment, the removal of the hypothesis of God from explaining the natural world. We've talked about a crisis of meaning. You can look at all of those. And now we're going to swing into the second half of this sermon series today, and we're going to stop talking about the ideas that got us here, and we're going to look at experiences that characterize the faith experience of this time. We're going to shift from looking at the ideas. Those are online. They're on the podcast. You can listen to those things. We're going to shift from looking at the ideas that got us here, and we're going to start talking about now experiences that we have in this time and what faith has to say to them. And one of the things that we experience in this time that is unique to this time is chronic exhaustion. Nobody can rest. Our text today is going to be from the book of Exodus, chapter 20, verses 8 to 11. I'd encourage you to open a Bible up. We've got Bibles in the back. If you don't have a Bible, you can grab one. You can take it home. I'm not going to have the main text up on the screen because we just got to open the Bible up in church. If we don't open the Bible up in church, we won't feel comfortable opening the Bible up anywhere. So grab a Bible or grab a device, whatever would be meaningful to you, open it up and just grow in your facility with the scripture text. I really need in this moment, someone help me remember to start remembering what page on the Pew Bibles the text is in, because that'd be a helpful thing to be able to tell people. Exodus is the second book of the Bible. Numbers is the fourth book of the Bible. Sorry, inside joke. The text is Exodus chapter 20, verses 8 to 11. And again, second book of the Bible, 20 chapters in. I'll read the text aloud. Exodus chapter 20, verses 8 to 11. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter, your male servant or your female servant or your livestock, or the sojourner who is within your gates. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that is in them, and rested the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. Our world is exhausted. The word exhaustion comes from the Latin word exhaustio, which means to completely drain out, have nothing left, to be completely drained out. And on multiple levels, our reality is entirely drained out. We can look at various levels of our physical reality and go, we're just exhausted upon exhausted upon exhausted. People have been talking for years now how our planet's exhausted. We're taking more resources than the planet can reproduce. We're exhausting our planet. Our society is exhausted. The Western world has been on an empire-building trajectory for hundreds of years, and it's arguably peaked and is exhausted. And all we have left to look at it now are the ways in which it's hurt other people and exhausted itself. These dynamics happen, of course, in societies all over the world and all over time. God speaks to this dynamic in the book of Jeremiah when he talks about the exhaustion that will come upon the Babylonian Empire. Jeremiah 51:64 says this, "Thus shall Babylon sink to rise no more because of the disaster that I am bringing upon her, and they shall become exhausted, spent, utterly drained." A city can be exhausted. I mean, one of the things that makes New Yorkers incredible is that New York is a place where there's too much going on. It feels like the city shouldn't work. It's overwhelmed, and yet New Yorkers get up every day and make it work anyways. That's part of what makes New Yorkers incredible. And at the same time, there's a limit even to that. In November of 2022, the state comptroller said that once the pandemic aid runs out, the MTA is going to be losing on average $2.5 billion a year. The comptroller said, we don't just need fare hikes. We need a totally new financial model. We live in a city that prides itself on being able to welcome people at any time. And yet we're in the middle of a crisis where New York is just welcoming more and more and more people. And 3 weeks ago, our mayor got up on a national stage and said, we don't have any more room. A city that prides itself on saying, we always have room. Its major leader is going, we do not have any more room. Even a city can be exhausted, and its people can become exhausted. And as much as we all love living in New York is an exhausting place to live. People who've never lived here don't understand. Everything in New York is hard. Everything's hard. Everything's exhausting. Just doing all the little things is just exhaustion piled on exhaustion on exhaustion. And you take all that and then you put it into just normal existential exhaustions we have in our life. I'm not myself yet. I'm still trying to figure me out, and I'm exhausted by it. I haven't gotten where I wanted to get in my career, all of these things. And we are just totally exhausted and spent and run out. And as a result, all we have in our lives is exhaust. Right? Exhaust, like the leftover of just the grinding over of a machine where the work is never done. Right? Like a car, right? Like instead of fruitfulness, instead of like I sowed into something and I harvested something that was meaningful and overflow and lasting, all we have left is exhaust. Toxic extra. What a different thing that is than fruitfulness and overflow. Exhaust. Just wasted, toxic extra. And that's all we have. And it's a sign of exhaustion in our lives. And no one wants to be around each other's exhaust. We do our best to hide it from other people. We're like, there are certain people who I'll never show that I'm exhausted. But then we get around to, unfortunately, it's almost always the people that we love and that are closest to. And we're like, all you get's my exhaust. It's like when you're in a dating relationship and you hide from the person you're dating certain exhaust functions that your body has. And then you get married, and there's this horrible moment of confession where you're like, I've been holding it in. This happened in our marriage. Adam is the best smelling boy I've ever met. I have a confession. There are more devastating forms of exhaust, however, like that exhaustive anger that we have. I have this useless, toxic, extra waste in my life of anger, and I hide it from everybody I can except for these few people, and they get it. They get the exhaust of my anger or the exhaust of my despair. Everyone else thinks I'm fine. Hide it from everyone. I go to work. Everything's great. Oh my gosh, that person's wonderful. If people talk about us, they would say all these wonderful things because we're all so nice these days. But no one actually knows that we have this exhaustive despair that is just growing in our lives. And it's going to suffocate us at some point. Our exhaust is toxic. It's awful, and it can kill any layer of a system, a planet, a city, people, a society. This exhaustion, where does it come from? Because, of course, we can do things at times, and at the end of them feel really full. We don't feel exhausted at all. Certain things we can engage in and go, I might feel like I spent a lot of energy, but I don't feel exhausted at the end of that. Exhaust is a particular experience that we have at the end of some kinds of work. And the Bible says that exhaust comes from the subordination of our time to our work. The Bible says that exhaust comes from the subordination of our time to our work. When we get that the other way around, when we subordinate our work to our time, then we have moments in our life where we stop working and we're done and we rest. But when we do it the other way around, when we subordinate our time to our work, the problem in this world is that the work is never done. It's never done. And when we subordinate our time to our work, we then shove all our time into the I'm never done working basket. And that is what leads to exhaustion. The Bible says that exhaustion comes from the subordination of our time to our work. And the work in this world is never done. And the God of the Bible is a very wise God. And he knew that in this world, the work is never done. And he knew that we would be tempted all the time, because the work is never done, to subordinate our time to our work. And so God built in a reality into the physical that flips that upside down and subordinates our work to our time. He created a portion of time where work is done just because we said it's done. Just because it's time for it to be done. God built this into creation, and he called it the Sabbath. The Sabbath is a day where our work is subordinated to time and not the other way around. The word Sabbath, Shabbat, comes from the Hebrew word Shavah. I'm sure you can hear the sound. Shavah means rest. And so the Hebrew word Shabbat is basically just capital R, rest. It's the rest day. Shavah, Shabbat, capital R, rest. And the Sabbath is the day when the work is done. In a world where the work is never done, the Sabbath is time that is set aside where the verdict simply is, the work is done. Look at Exodus chapter 20, verse 9. The text says, 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. 6 days you will labor and do all your work. That's a very interesting phrase. We might look at that and go, but what if all my work isn't done in 6 days? This text says, you're not thinking about that the right way then. Whatever work you got done in those 6 days, that was all your work. And now you're done. In 6 days, you'll do all your work, and then on the Sabbath day, you will rest. And this Sabbath is not just for individual people. It's supposed to spread out into society. This day of rest, this day where the work is done, it's supposed to spread out into all areas of society. Verse 10 says, the seventh day is a Sabbath to your Lord, and you won't do any work, and no work will be done in any area that is under your control. Any people in your employ, any people in your family, any animals that you own, any land that you have, it will all Sabbath. Because on the Sabbath day, the work is done. It's finished. Now, the challenge here is that the Bible also tells us and witnesses to the fact that it's possible to Sabbath wrong. It's possible to get rest wrong. And there are two ways that it's possible to get rest wrong. The first way is connected to the word remember in verse 8 of chapter 20. The text says, remember the Sabbath. The first and most obvious way that we can get rest wrong is by not physically doing it. That's why the text says, remember the Sabbath. Observe it, keep it, remember it. If you don't do it, you're getting it wrong. And this shows up in the life and history of the book of, in the people of Israel. The prophets railed against Israel's ability to stop and to rest and keep the Sabbath. So for example, in Ezekiel chapter 20, verses 18, 19 to 21, the text says this, and I said to their children in the wilderness, I am the Lord your God, walk in my statutes and be careful to obey my rules and keep my Sabbaths holy, that they may be a sign between me and you, that you may know that I am the Lord your God. But the children rebelled against me. They did not walk in my statutes. They were not careful to obey my rules, by which if a person does them, he shall live. They profaned my Sabbaths. We can get rest wrong when we don't do it. We get the Sabbath wrong when we don't do it. And this has been a problem and a challenge for people for thousands of years, just stopping to rest. But there is a deeper issue here, and a deeper way that we can rest wrong. The issue, and the prophets also speak to this, is that we can rest physically, we can stop doing things physically, and still somehow not be resting. You hear what I'm saying? We can physically be Sabbathing correctly because we're not doing stuff, we're observing it, and somehow we are missing the reality of rest. This shows up also in the Old Testament prophets. For example, Amos chapter 8 verses 4 to 6 says this, hear this, you who trample on the needy and bring the poor of the land to an end, saying, when will the new moon be over, that we may sell grain? And the Sabbath, that we may offer wheat for sale, that we may make the ephah small and the shekel great, and deal deceitfully with false balances, that we may buy the poor for silver and the needy for a pair of sandals, and sell the chaff of the wheat. There are two ways here where the Sabbath is being gotten wrong, and it has nothing to do with what they're doing physically. It's about what they're doing spiritually. God says, if you have all these unjust practices in your life, and yet you think you're successfully keeping the Sabbath, you're wrong. You're not actually participating in the reality of rest. God also says, if you are resting and the only thing that you're doing in your mind and spirit is saying, I can't wait for this to be over so I can get back to work, God's like, that's not rest. You're getting it wrong, right? It says it right there, right? When will the new moon be over and the Sabbath be over, that we can go back to work, that we can go back and sell it? When is this time going to be done? God's like, that's not rest. That's not rest. Something is going wrong. And it's not just about what we're doing physically, it's what we're doing non-physically. Rest is more than not doing anything. It doesn't just have a physical dimension, it has a spiritual dimension. And we know this in our own lives. We recognize it and see it in our own lives. The ceasing of work is just a pure physical reality. We can cease work, and who knows how we'll receive that. Maybe it'll be restful, maybe it won't be. We can stop working and replace it with something else, right? Everyone's searching for that kind of solution today. I'm done working, but I'm replacing it with fun. I'm replacing it with travel. I'm replacing it with friends or excitement or distraction or something like that. And listen, of course, that's a valuable thing. That's a good thing to do. But we can also get to the end of that road and go, I'm still not rested. I experienced this in my own life. I love to rest by having fun and playing games. I love to do it. Love it, love it, love it, love it, love it. And I've got a group of guys right now in the church that we have been obsessed over this video game called Smash Bros. Ultimate, and we've been playing it too much. And whenever I feel like I need to rest, I'm like, I want to play, I want to compete, I want to laugh, and all this sort of stuff. And I go, and at first, it feels really wonderful and restful. But something begins to happen where when what my soul needs is rest, and all I'm giving it is fun, I begin to experience a diminishing return. And I want to publicly state that diminishing return that I experience has nothing to do with the fact that there is an unnamed person named Chris Harrell who's gotten too good at the game and now beats everyone every time. So again, I just want to publicly state that diminishing return that I experience has nothing to do with the fact that this person who will remain nameless, named Chris, beats me all the time. It has nothing to do with that. I just want to, for the record, publicly state that. It's possible to get to the end of that road, right? Whatever it is, fun, friends, self-care, physical restoration, and go, why does this have diminishing returns? This is still meeting some needs, but I am not rested. My inner being cannot stretch out and feel filled up again. I'm not able to reliably put myself in a place where I'm experiencing that kind of rest. And the fact that our experiences of this in the physical teach us this about rest reveals something to us about the nature of rest. Rest does not just have a physical dimension, it has a spiritual dimension. Rest is not just a physical reality. In fact, it's not even primarily a physical reality. It is a spiritual reality. This is what Exodus chapter 20, verse 11 says. That tells him to do all this stuff in the physical, for in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea and all that is in them, and rested the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. You should do all these things in the physical, the text says, because there is a reality in the nature of God where God works and then God's done. That is a spiritual reality in the nature and being of God. Not God works and then God paused. Not God works and then God did something else for a second. God works and then God is done. And in a world where the work is never over, we cannot rest because we are crying out to encounter some reality that puts us into a place where we go, the work is done. It's not paused. I'm not filling up with something else. It's done. Rest has a spiritual dimension that is reflected in the nature and being of God. The spiritual reality of work being done, finished, is the essence of rest. The spiritual reality of work being done is the essence of rest. And this is why we have no rest in our secular time. This is why we have no rest. Because the work in our time is never done, and our time has eclipsed the spiritual. It has eclipsed and hidden the spiritual from people. All this stuff we've been talking about in the last couple weeks, the spiritual is so much harder to lay hold of in a secular time where it feels like God isn't real and it feels like we can't lay hold of anything but physical things around us. And the fact is that rest is a spiritual reality. And so in a time where our age has eclipsed for everyone, any kind of spiritual resource. People are running around exhausted because rest is a spiritual reality and nobody knows how to get it anymore. That's why we are all so tired in this time. Because rest is a spiritual reality and we're living in a time where that spiritual reality has been eclipsed and hidden. This isn't just for people outside of the church. It's happening for people inside the church as well. There's a current currently in the church where everyone's looking at how tired we are. Everyone's looking at how exhausted people in churches and ministries are. And wisely, people have read the Bible and they've gone, oh my gosh, there's this thing in the Bible called the Sabbath. Maybe we should all start Sabbathing. Did I say Sabbathing? Sabbathing. Oh gosh, that's gonna, I don't know, Sabbath Christi. I'm just looking like run. This is where my mind goes. I just keep going. Sabbathing in the church. People have looked at exhaustion in churches and exhaustion in ministries, and they've wisely opened the Bible and said, there's this reality in the Bible called the Sabbath. We should all do it. Of course, there is wisdom and necessity to set time aside to rest. It's almost impossible to engage in the spiritual reality of rest without setting aside time. But as soon as we say, I'm so exhausted, what should I do to find rest? And someone comes in and says, how about you get better at your Sabbath practice? That's just another work now. We can't take it on. Right? And again, I'm not speaking against the value of disciplines. I'm not speaking against wisdom and setting aside time. I'm saying that as soon as we look at ourselves and go, I'm exhausted, if only I were better at this physical practice, we've made it a law. We've made it a work, and there is no rest there. There's just another thing that I'm bad at. Great, awesome. One more thing that I'm bad at in the spiritual life. I'm bad at everything. One more thing that's supposed to be restful that I go, and now I'm preparing for my Sabbath practice, and oh my gosh, I didn't get all the hours in, or I didn't do it right, or I didn't read that book right. It just becomes another work. Inside and outside the church, outside and inside the church. We are exhausted because the work is never over. It's never done. And we take these things in the church and we make them works all over again. Here's some more works for you to do in your spiritual life so that you feel more rested. The problem is that the work is never done. We need to encounter not a physical practice, but a spiritual reality where the work is done. That would bring us rest. The reason why no one can rest in our age is not because people don't have enough ideas for how to physically relax. We're full of ideas for how to physically relax. The reason why no one can rest today is because no one is touching the spiritual reality of rest. We have all sorts of practices and all sorts of ideas, and no one is encountering the spiritual reality. Because the Sabbath is not primarily a physical reality. The Sabbath is primarily a spiritual sign of a spiritual reality. That there is a reality where the work is done. That's what the Sabbath is a sign of. The Sabbath is the sign that there is a world, there is a place, there is a reality where the work is done. And the Bible says that world is real and it calls it the kingdom of heaven. The Bible says that in the kingdom of heaven, that world is full of rest because it's a world where the work is done. It's finished. We don't have rest because we're doing all this physical stuff and somehow we're not coming into contact with the reality that there is a world right now where the work is done. Look at this moment in the book of Mark. Gospel of Mark. Mark chapter 3, verses 1 to 6. Hear a passage about healing and the Sabbath. This is what the text says. Again, Jesus entered the synagogue, and a man was there with a withered hand. And they watched Jesus to see whether he would heal him on the Sabbath, so that they might accuse him. And he said to the man with the withered hand, "Come here." And he said to them, "Is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do harm, to save life or to kill?" But they were silent. And he looked around at them with anger, grieved at their hardness of heart, and said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." He stretched it out, and his hand was restored. the Pharisees went out and immediately held counsel with the Herodians against him, how to destroy him. Look at what happens here. The question is whether or not Jesus is going to work on the Sabbath, whether or not he's going to do a work. Jesus, the healing happens, right? And that's why they go out and, want to destroy him. So like, he did some sort of work. But what actually happens in this passage? Jesus does nothing. He does nothing, right? The things that normally would characterize a healing passage of Jesus, right? He's usually either laying a hand on someone or he's commanding them to be healed. And yet all Jesus is doing in this passage is he's daring the Pharisees to watch him do nothing. He's like, watch me do nothing. Watch me stand here and do absolutely nothing. He tells the man to break the Sabbath rule. The man lifts his hand up. You're not supposed to do anything on the Sabbath. You're not supposed to lift your hand towards any kind of work. Jesus does nothing, and the man lifts up his hand and breaks the Sabbath rule. And as he does that, his hand is just healed. How does it happen? How does that healing happen? That man, in breaking the physical rule of rest, touched the spiritual reality of God's rest. He touched Sabbath, not practice, reality. He touched Sabbath reality. He touched the kingdom of heaven, the world where the work of healings this man's body is already done. And when he touched it, his hand was healed. Jesus did nothing. He didn't say anything. He didn't lay hands. There's no magic healing stuff going on. He just reached a reality that was real and already external to him. The reality of the Sabbath rest of God. And his hand was healed. Now, God can do this for us physically in our own bodies. We believe in physical healing here and all that sort of stuff. But these things in Jesus' life, in Jesus' own self-understanding, are themselves signs in the physical of our spiritual and immaterial condition. Our souls are withered. They are withered. They have withered on the vine. They are strung out and wrung out and overspent and overused. Every last thing in this age has squeezed out any of the life and water that's left in our souls and left in our spirits. It's just been wrung out and wrung out and run out again and then left out to air dry. And our soul's just a crusty, wrinkled, empty, dead thing. But we would experience the rest of God. If we would lift our own soul up, it would touch the rest of God and it would stretch out immediately. That is the reality of the rest of God. All of the withered and wrung out areas of this world, if it would just rise and breathe and stretch out and touch, not restful practice, but restful reality, our society would go, thank God there's a society where all the work is already done. The work's never done in our society. It's never done. And that's part good news for us because we should always keep working to care for the planet and care for justice and care for people. That work is never done. But that's also profoundly bad news to us, isn't it? Because if the work is never done, we cannot rest and that will kill us. It is death in our lives to be like, what do you mean the work is never done? But if we could touch the reality of a world where the work is already done, we would stretch back out. We would fill back up. And then we wouldn't escape out there. We would come back into this time and this place and go, I'm now full to get back to work in a place where the work is not yet done. Our society would be revived by that. Our city would be revived by that. Our personal lives would be revived if we could stretch out and touch the reality of a world where the work is done. And that is made possible by the death and resurrection of Jesus. It really is made possible by faith in the death and resurrection of Jesus. Jesus came to this physical world to perform a work, to turn and transform death from a dead end into a doorway. And on the cross, he said, it's finished. That work is done. It's done. And so you know that if you are in Jesus, because he's taken on your human nature is now able to treat death not like a dead end, but like a doorway. And if that is true, then in Jesus, you have a sure promise of rest. And that is the thing. Faith in that future promise is where rest comes from now. Rest now comes from faith that I am going to rest in the future. There is no other place that rest comes from. The language of faith and belief is like falling on hard times today. Faith, it sounds childlike, and Jesus said become like a child. It sounds like something that we're like, oh, faith and belief, that's the thing that we go to when you don't understand stuff. But that is not true. Faith is the only mechanism that can make present a sure future reality. If you knew that in the future that a certain something was coming, why not live in that reality now? There is no other way that happens except for faith. It's not a cop-out. It's not some silly thing. It is the gift of God to live the rest of the future in your exhausted present. This is what it says in the book of Hebrews. Hebrews chapter 3, verse 19 through chapter 4, verse 2. So we see that they, the children of Israel, were unable to enter because of their unbelief. Therefore, while the promise of entering his rest still stands, let us fear lest any of you should seem to have failed to reach it. For good news came to us just as to them, but the message they heard did not benefit them because they were not united by faith of those who listened. In the context here of the children of Israel, they were wandering in the wilderness. And God came to them and said to you, I have a land for you. I have a rest for you in a homeland. And this text is saying that was a sure promise. And so those people should have been able to rest even then in the wilderness, had they just believed the truth of that word. You have the exact same situation on offer for you. There is a world, it already exists, where everything is done. All the work is done. All the work that you cannot let go of. The ladder climbing, the endless race that we're all on here. We're like in an endless race of ladder climbing against other people. There's no finish line. No one knows where the finish line of that race is. All the mile markers are just all the other people I've passed. It's an endless, finish line-less race. Our inability to let go of that. The things in our relationships, the work that's not done, the work that's not done with our children, the work that's undone in myself. We feel like we're not ourselves yet. We haven't become ourselves. All of that work. There is a world now where that work is done. It's done. And when you get there, you are going to breathe the deepest breath you've ever breathed. The power to rest now simply comes from believing that Jesus has made sure that future reality. And so when you're in the present, when you're in that place, in your job, in your relationships, in anything where you are strung out, what you need is spiritual Sabbath reality to just breathe in that moment and go, there is another world where this work is already done. And the power of God's rest will come to you. We need to encounter the spiritual reality of God's Sabbath rest. That is the power to rest in this time. This world and this time cannot rest because the work is never done. But there is a world that is full now of rest because all the work there is already finished. You can lay hold of the rest of that world and bring it into your present now by belief in Jesus, and taste now the rest that God created you for.